The Consciousness Code Podcast Episode 5, The Sliding Scale of Awareness, Why You Are Not Equally Conscious All Day. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code Podcast. In the last episode, we explored autopilot living, the strange and often painful reality that a person can become highly functional, highly adapted, socially coherent, and yet inwardly absent. We looked at repetition, role, identity, performance, and the ways life can begin living through us by sequence rather than by conscious participation. In this episode, we move into something even more foundational. Because beneath all of that, beneath the habits, beneath the roles, beneath the performances, beneath the patterns we repeat, and the selves we rehearse, there is another truth that many of us still underestimate. Awareness itself is not fixed. It shifts. It expands and contracts. It sharpens and dulls. It narrows and widens. It gathers and fragments. It becomes clear in one moment and strangely distant in the next. Yet most of us still live as though consciousness were one steady thing. We speak as though there were one stable moving through the day, with one consistent degree of awareness, one consistent access to clarity, one consistent emotional range, one consistent capacity to perceive reality cleanly and respond to it wisely. But that is not how most of us actually live. In lived experience, consciousness moves. It changes with fatigue. It changes with grief. It changes with attraction. It changes with stress. It changes with relief. It changes with purpose. It changes with illness. It changes with overstimulation. It changes with whether we feel safe, seen, overloaded, ashamed, settled, hurried, connected, or cut off. So this episode is really about learning to respect fluctuation, not as a weakness, not as an inconsistency in the moral sense, not as proof that something is wrong with us, but as a basic condition of being alive. Because once we begin to understand that awareness moves in gradients, a great many things start making more sense. Why can we be generous one moment and reactive the next? Why does the same situation feel manageable on one day and overwhelming on another? Why sometimes we feel like ourselves and other times feel as though some narrower, sharper, more contracted version of us has taken over? Why are certain truths available in one state and almost unreachable in another? This matters for more than self-understanding. It matters for relationships, for communication, for decision-making, for mental health, for identity, for responsibility, for how we interpret our own experience, and for how harshly we judge ourselves when we do not remain the same from hour to hour. Because one of the most painful illusions many of us carry is the illusion of the stable self. The illusion that if we were really mature, really conscious, really integrated, really self-aware, we would remain clear in the same way all the time. But perhaps maturity is not sameness. Perhaps maturity is the growing capacity to recognize the fluctuations honestly, to understand what shapes them, and to work with them rather than building identity out of whichever state happens to be loudest in the moment. That is where we are going today. Into awareness as movement, into consciousness as a spectrum rather than a switch, into the uncomfortable but freeing recognition that who we seem to be changes with conditions. In many ways, this episode is an invitation to become a little less absolute with yourself, a little less certain that the state you are in right now is the whole truth of who you are, a little less quick to turn temporary contraction into permanent identity, a little more curious about the conditions shaping perception, a little more respectful of the fact that the self is not always equally available to itself. So that is where we begin. With a simple but unsettling truth. You are not equally conscious all day. That may sound obvious at first, but most of us do not really live as though it were true. We still judge ourselves and others as though awareness should remain roughly the same across different hours, different conditions, different emotional states, different bodily states, and different environments. We still speak in fixed identity language. This is who I am. This is how I am. This is how I think. This is what I'm like, as though the self were one continuous, evenly available presence moving through the whole day unchanged. But if you pay attention honestly, that is not how experience unfolds. There are moments when you are sharper, more spacious, more capable of nuance. Moments when things land cleanly, when you can hear more than one layer at once, when your body feels available, when your mind is not rushing to defend or conclude, when thought and feeling seem more aligned, when the world has a little more depth to it. Then there are moments when awareness narrows. Moments when everything feels louder, more immediate, more pressing, more personal, more absolute. Moments when patience drops, complexity becomes harder to hold, the body tightens, interpretation accelerates, and the whole field of experience contracts around whatever feels most urgent, threatening, or emotionally charged. Those are not rare exceptions. That is ordinary life. You can feel bright and open in the morning, then scattered by afternoon, clear after rest, then blunt after overstimulation, soft after relief, then hard after stress, available in one conversation, then strangely absent in the next, grounded in solitude, then fragmented in crowds, capable of perspective one day, and barely able to think beyond the immediate feeling the next. This fluctuation is so basic to lived experience that it is almost strange we continue to resist it. Perhaps we resist it because we want continuity. We want to believe in a single stable self that remains available in the same way under all conditions. We want our clarity to feel like a possession rather than a temporary configuration. We want the version of ourselves we admire most to be the version that stays. We want to believe that if we have understood something once, we should be able to access it every time. but that is not what it feels like to be alive. The truth is that awareness has weather, it has climates, it has changing visibility, it has times of spaciousness and times of compression, times when things feel sharp and times when things feel dull, times when you can stay with complexity and times when even small things become total. One of the reasons this matters so much is that we build identity too quickly out of temporary states. When you are tired, you may think, I'm not good with people. When you are ashamed, I'm weak. When you are overstimulated, I can't cope. When you are relieved, I finally figured it out. When you are emotionally activated, I know exactly what's happening. When you are numb, I don't care anymore. When you are grieving, I've lost myself. When you are attracted, this must mean something profound. When you are exhausted, everything is too much. Sometimes there is truth in those statements, but often they are also statements pretending to be identity statements. That is one of the most important recognitions in this entire episode. A state can feel like self, and because it feels like self while you are in it, it can be very hard to remember that it is not the whole of you. This is why some people feel as though they become different people under different conditions, because in a meaningful sense, different states do reveal different access points to the self. Not different souls, not separate personalities in the dramatic sense, but different levels of available awareness, patience, emotional tolerance, interpretive range, bodily openness, and responsiveness. The self at rest is not the self under shame in the same way. The self in grief is not the self in relief in the same way. The self in attraction is not the self in fatigue in the same way. The self under pressure is not the self after regulation in the same way. This is where so much confusion begins, because many of us treat the self under pressure as the truest self simply because pressure feels intense. Or we treat the self in despair as the final self simply because despair feels convincing. Or we treat the self in relief as the fully healed self simply because relief creates so much temporary spaciousness. But none of those states on their own should be mistaken for the whole story. That does not mean they are unreal. It means they are partial, and conscious living requires that we become more literate in partiality. This is especially relevant in everyday life because state changes are often subtle before they become obvious. Awareness does not always dramatically switch off. More often it thins, it drifts, it becomes more selective. You stop taking in the room as fully. You stop hearing the same tone. You lose some capacity for perspective. Your body becomes narrower, your attention sharper but less spacious, and your emotional tolerance lower. And because all of this can happen gradually, many of us do not notice the shift until we are already deep inside it. That is why the hook for this episode is not just philosophical, it is practical. If you are not equally conscious all day, then much of your life is being shaped by fluctuating access to patience, access to reflection, access to nuance, access to emotional truth, access to bodily contact, access to the wider picture, access to the version of yourself you most trust. And if that is true, then you cannot understand yourself well by treating awareness as fixed. You have to understand yourself through states. When do I narrow? When do I widen? When does my world become smaller? When do I become more available? What conditions make me more reflective? What conditions make me more reactive? What kinds of fatigue, hunger, overload, urgency, shame, or excitement alter my access to perspective? These are not minor questions. They are central to self-knowledge. Because many of the things we blame on character are actually shaped by the state. Many of the things we call who I am are actually how I am when tired, how I am when unseen, how I am when hurried, how I am when safe, how I am when threatened, how I am when emotionally flooded, how I am when rested enough to widen. And once you begin to see that, self-judgment starts to soften, not because everything becomes excusable, but because it becomes more intelligible. You begin to understand why you cannot expect one stable level of clarity across all conditions. You begin to see why some truths disappear when you are depleted and return when you are resourced. You begin to notice that your relationship to yourself is not fixed, but changing all the time with the changing terrain of the body, the mind, and the world around you. That is not an excuse to become passive. It is a call to become more accurate. Because once you accept that you are not equally conscious all day, you stop demanding sameness from yourself in conditions that are not the same. You begin to pay attention to the conditions. You become more precise, more humble, more observant, less hypnotized by whichever state happens to be loudest. That may be the first real step toward living with more intelligence, not pretending that awareness is fixed, but learning to recognize the shape of its movement. Because if consciousness shifts, and it does, then wisdom may begin not in denying the fluctuation, but in learning how to see it earlier, understand it more clearly, and stop building your whole identity out of whichever version of you happens to be speaking at the time. Consciousness as spectrum, not switch. We often speak about consciousness as though it were a light switch, on or off, awake or not awake, present or absent, conscious or unconscious. That language is useful in a rough, everyday sense. If someone faints, loses consciousness under anesthetic, enters deep sleep, or emerges again into wakefulness, the switch metaphor seems to fit well enough. But as soon as we look more closely at lived experience, or at what neuroscience has been showing for decades, that picture becomes far too simple. Consciousness is not best understood as a fixed on or off state. It is better understood as a spectrum, a moving field, a fluctuating range of access. It has gradients. It has intensity. It has textures. It sharpens, dulls, narrows, widens, fragments, saturates, drifts, and regathers depending on the conditions in which life is being lived. That is not a mystical language. It is simply more faithful to experience, and increasingly more consistent with what neurophysiology, attention research, sleep science, and consciousness studies suggest as well. Wang, in 2024, reviewing neuroimaging and electrophysiology techniques in consciousness research, made the point very directly. Even clinically, consciousness is not one simple thing, because wakefulness and awareness are not identical. That distinction matters. Wakefulness is not the same as depth of awareness. Alertness is not the same as insight. Mental activity is not the same as conscious presence. A person can be fully awake while moving through very different grades of access to themselves, to their surroundings, to complexity, to emotional truth, and to the wider field of meaning. This is where science becomes helpful, not because it settles the mystery of consciousness once and for all, but because it offers methods for noticing how unstable and state-dependent awareness really is. Take EEG, for example, electroencephalography. EEG tracks electrical patterns at the scalp and gives us excellent temporal resolution, meaning it can show how brain activity changes from moment to moment. It has been used for decades in sleep research, attention research, seizure research, and disorders of consciousness. Reviews in 2023 and 2024 continue to describe EEG and fMRI as among the most widely used tools in consciousness research because they reveal something simple but profound. Brain activity reorganizes across different conscious conditions. Different states, wakefulness, sleep, drowsiness, fatigue, overload, sedation, varying levels of attention, do not all look the same. They carry different physiological signatures. Sleep research makes this especially obvious. In a 2024 review on consciousness and sleep, Tononi and colleagues discussed how local EEG slowing can appear even during wakefulness, especially under sleep deprivation. That is a striking point, because it means that parts of the brain can begin showing sleep-like behavior even when the person is technically awake. In other words, wakefulness itself is not uniform. You can be up, moving, talking, functioning, and yet awareness is already changing in quality because the underlying neural conditions have shifted. Most of us know something about that without ever needing a brain scan. We know what it is like to be awake but foggy, awake but blunt, awake but far away, awake but unable to hold complexity, awake but much less available to ourselves. This is exactly why the switch metaphor breaks down. If consciousness were simply on or off, then once we were awake we would be equally available in the same way all day. But that is not how life feels. There are hours when awareness is richer, more spacious, more integrated. And there are hours when awareness is thin, narrowed, overloaded, or fragmented. The body knows it. The mind often feels it. Neurophysiology confirms it. Attention research says the same thing in another language. Sieberger and colleagues in 2024, studying time-varying functional connectivity and attentional zones, showed that attention fluctuates continuously and that these fluctuations map onto dynamic changes in large-scale brain network activity. That is important because attention is one of the core gates of consciousness. If attention changes, the field of awareness changes with it. Not everything is equally accessible all the time. Not everything is equally vivid, equally meaningful, or equally workable in every state. This helps explain why the same world can feel so different from one hour to the next. You may be more open in one state and more defensive in another, more curious in one state and more rigid in another, more emotionally permeable in one state and more shut down in another, more reflective in one state and more interpretively narrow in another, and that is not only psychological. It is physiological, it is attentional, it is relational, it is environmental, and it is state-dependent. There is also a philosophical depth to this that is worth respecting. Phenomenology has always resisted the flattening of consciousness into one uniform thing. From Husserl onward, consciousness was treated not as a blank slate, but as structured, intentional, and lived. It is always consciousness of something, and the way that something appears is shaped by how the subject is related to it in that moment. Later phenomenology, especially in Merleau-Ponty, deepened this further by insisting that consciousness is embodied. It is not hovering above the body. It is lived through it. That means fluctuation is not an accident. It is built into the very fact that consciousness is embodied, affective, temporal, and situated. Neuroscience, in a very different register, often ends up pointing in a surprisingly similar direction. The body and the brain are not producing one flat level of awareness and simply feeding it the world. They are continually adjusting thresholds, salience, energy allocation, prediction, and responsiveness. Interoception research, especially the work reviewed by Feldman and colleagues in 2024 on the neurobiology of interoception and affect, shows that bodily state is deeply involved in affective experience. The state of the body contributes to how experience feels from the inside. If bodily state shifts, the conscious field shifts with it. Consciousness is not just a question of whether something is being experienced at all. It is also a question of how it is being experienced. With what richness, with what sharpness, with what coherence, with what bodily support, with what tolerance for ambiguity, with what degree of emotional bandwidth. That is why awake is too blunt a word. A person can be awake and cognitively saturated, awake and half absorbed, awake and detached, awake and deeply present, awake and mentally diffuse, awake and painfully overfocused. These are all different modes of conscious access. This is also where methods matter. EEG gives us temporal precision. fMRI gives us a broader map of changing network involvement. FNRS, MEG, and eye tracking add other layers. Pupillometry, for example, gives us a window into changing autonomic and attentional state. Biddell in 2024, working within an active inference framework, discusses autonomic arousal and uncertainty in ways that connect very clearly to conscious fluctuation. Increasing arousal changes the conditions under which the world is interpreted, not one thing. There is the bright, organized arousal of purpose, the compressed, narrowed arousal of anxiety, the agitated arousal of overload, the flat, strained state of mental fatigue, the softened, more coherent state of relief. Each of these states creates a different version of the self in experience. And this is why consciousness as a spectrum is a more accurate picture than consciousness as a switch. Some states widen the field, others shrink it, some allow complexity, others force simplification, some deepen contact, others strip it back to a narrower, more defensive form. Fatigue is a good example. Recent work in 2025 by Schumann and colleagues on the brain's fatigue network points toward frontal cingulate, insular, thalamic, and striatal involvement in mental fatigue. You do not need to know the exact networks to feel the reality of it. Mental fatigue changes consciousness. It reduces tolerance. It lowers flexibility. It alters what feels manageable. The same person under exhaustion is not moving through the day with the same degree of access as the rested person. Research, including the 2025 Mechanistic Review by Chmiel and colleagues, suggests that emotional exhaustion consumes cognitive resources and changes the conditions for task performance. Again, the broader point is simple. Different states do not just change energy levels. They change the form of awareness available, or how we build identity. Because if consciousness is a spectrum rather than a switch, then many of the things we call personality may actually be state-dependent expressions. The clear self may not always be available. The patient self may depend on conditions. The confident self may partly be the relieved self. The detached self may partly be the exhausted or shut down self. The intense self may partly be the over-aroused self. That does not mean identity is meaningless. It means identity is less fixed than it often appears. This is where contemporary modeling of consciousness becomes interesting too. Hansen, in 2024, writing in Neuroscience of Consciousness, argued for paying more attention to developments in consciousness over time, not only as static snapshots, but as processes unfolding across temporal extension. That is a very useful idea for this episode. Consciousness may not be something best captured at a single instant because it changes. It has movement. It has phases. It develops and dissolves across time, like weather, rather than remaining a constant light. Lived reality. You are not equally conscious all day because the conditions of consciousness are not static all day. Your body changes. Your attention changes. Your social environment changes. Your metabolic state changes. Your emotional field changes. Your relational context changes. Your arousal changes. Your sense of safety changes. So the spectrum model is not just more scientifically defensible. It is more humane. It gives us a language for why we are not the same under all conditions without turning that into failure. It allows us to say, I was conscious but narrowed. I was awake but thinly available. I was present but overloaded. I was here but fragmented. I was functioning but not richly aware. Those distinctions matter because they create precision where self-judgment usually rushes in. And if we go even further into contemporary consciousness research, the same conclusion appears at the clinical edges too. Work on disorders of consciousness, like the 2024 studies on EEG timescale dynamics by Zhang and colleagues, and broader reviews in 2024 and 2025, increasingly support continuum or spectrum models rather than neat binaries. Even in severe clinical states, the field is moving toward more nuanced pictures of awareness as graded, unstable, and temporally complex. If that is true at the clinical margins, then it makes even more sense in ordinary life. Methods like TMS and state-dependent stimulation research. Reviews of state-dependent neural stimulation have shown that the effect of stimulation depends partly on the state the brain is already in. The same intervention does not produce the same response across all conditions. That is a helpful metaphor even beyond the lab. It tells us that the brain is not a passive machine responding identically every time. State matters. Context matters. Readiness matters. What is possible in one state may not be possible in another in the same way. In one direction, consciousness is dynamic, not only philosophically, not only emotionally, not only spiritually, but neurophysiologically. Once we start taking that seriously, the idea of one stable self begins to loosen. You are not equally available under grief and relief, under shame and belonging, under attraction and depletion, under illness and vitality, and under urgency and spaciousness. So perhaps the question is not, am I conscious or not? Perhaps it is, what degree of access is available right now? What kind of awareness is possible in this state? What has become sharper? What has become narrower? What has become unreachable? What has widened? That is a much more faithful way of meeting experience. It changes how we relate to ourselves. It makes us less likely to absolutize the current state, less likely to turn a temporary contraction into a permanent identity, less likely to judge the self at 9 p.m. by the standards of the self at 9 a.m., less likely to imagine that the clearest, most spacious version of us should be available in every condition. That is not lowering the standard. It is raising the accuracy, because consciousness as lived is not a switch we flip once and then possess evenly. It is a sliding scale, a changing terrain, a fluctuating field of access. Once we understand that, we can begin to work with awareness more intelligently, not by demanding sameness, but by becoming more literate in movement, more literate in what sharpens awareness, what dulls it, what narrows it, what widens it, what gives us richer contact, what leaves us only thinly available, and that, perhaps, is the deeper invitation of this section, to stop speaking about consciousness as though it were one flat possession, and begin meeting it as a living continuum that changes with state, body, context, and time, because the self you are in one state is not the only self available to you. The more honestly you understand that, the less likely you are to mistake one temporary mode of consciousness for the whole truth of who you are. Why awareness changes moment to moment. Awareness changes because life keeps changing, and we do not receive those changes from some neutral height above the body. We receive them through a living system, through blood chemistry, fatigue, attention, memory, expectation, social context, bodily arousal, emotion, and meaning all interact at once. The mind is not standing outside this, calmly interpreting from a detached platform. It is inside the shifting field. That is why the same person can seem spacious in 1 hour and contracted in the next, generous in one state and brittle in another, reflective at midday and reactive by evening. Consciousness moves because the conditions that make it possible are moving. Neuroscience, phenomenology, attention research, and interoception research all point toward this in different languages, even when they disagree on the deepest theory of what consciousness finally is. Wang, in 2024, reviewing neuroimaging and electrophysiology in consciousness science, argued that wakefulness and awareness should not be collapsed into one thing, because even in clinical settings, they come apart in important ways. Let's slow this down through an ordinary scenario. You wake after a poor sleep. At first, nothing dramatic happens. You are awake. You can stand up, move, speak, check your phone, get dressed, make tea or coffee, and begin the day. From the outside, everything appears normal enough. But physiologically, the system is already different. Sleep loss changes attention, working memory, emotional regulation, effort tolerance, and the stability of the neural conditions that support wakeful awareness. Tononi and colleagues in 2024 discussed how local sleep-like activity can intrude into wakefulness under sleep deprivation, meaning that parts of the brain can behave in more sleep-like ways even while the person is technically awake. So you are not imagining it when the world feels thinner, when complexity is harder to hold, when small things start costing more. Then the first email arrives. It is brief, slightly more abrupt than you expected. Nothing overtly hostile. Nothing you could easily prove in a courtroom of reason, and yet the body reads it differently than it would on a well-rested day. Step 1. The eyes register the words. Step 2. Tone is inferred almost instantly. Step 3. The body tightens slightly, perhaps in the chest, perhaps in the jaw, perhaps in the stomach. Step 4. Attention narrows. Step 5. The mind begins predicting meaning. Step 6. A thought appears that felt off. Step 7. A second thought appears. Have I done something wrong? Or why are they speaking to me like that? Or I don't have the bandwidth for this today. Now, if we tell the story backwards, it sounds as though the thought created the state. But in lived sequence, the state often arrives first, or at least jointly. The body shifts, attention changes, and the thought grows from inside that shift. This is one reason predictive processing has become so compelling as a framework. It suggests that the brain is not merely waiting for raw reality to arrive before deciding what it means. It is constantly generating expectations, weighing incoming signals, and updating or defending its predictions. The world is being perceived through prior models. The scientific report study by Turker and colleagues in 2024 on dynamic brain connectivity and conscious perception supports this broader idea. Ongoing brain states influence whether external stimuli are successfully detected at all. In other words, what is available to consciousness is partly shaped by the state of the system before the event even arrives. Now imagine the same email arriving on a day when you have slept well, eaten, had time to think, and are not already carrying tension. The words may still be brief, but the body does not organize around them in the same way. There is more room. The first tightening may not happen at all, or if it does not dominate the whole field. A second interpretation remains possible. Maybe they're rushed. Maybe this isn't about me. Maybe I should ask before concluding. Same email, different states, different consciousness. This is why awareness changes moment to moment, not because reality becomes unreal, but because the conditions of access keep changing. Attention science tells the same story from another angle. Seeberger and colleagues in 2024 showed that attention fluctuates through dynamic brain states rather than remaining stable across time. Even without any major external drama, the system oscillates. Vigilance rises and falls. Distraction comes and goes. Salience shifts. What enters the center of awareness changes. So the idea of a fixed level of consciousness through the day is not supported by lived experience or by attention research. The field is moving even when the room seems still. Consider another scenario. You are in conversation with someone you care about. They pause a little too long before answering. Their face changes almost imperceptibly. Their voice becomes flatter. Again, nothing decisive. Nothing you could easily pin down in one sentence. But the body reads the shift. Step 1, an unexpected pause. Step 2, the body orients. Step 3, breathing changes slightly. Step 4, memory begins feeding likely meanings into the moment. Step 5, attention narrows around the other person's face and tone. Step 6, the rest of the room recedes. Step 7, consciousness contracts around one question: what's wrong? If you are in a relatively open, regulated state, you may notice that contraction and stay with it. You may ask calmly, you seem a little distant, are you all right? But if the body is already fatigued, ashamed, anxious, or primed by earlier experiences of withdrawal, the whole event may become something else before language has even caught up. The pause becomes rejection. The flatness becomes evidence. The body does not simply detect the pause. It builds a world around it. This is where interoception matters. Feldman and colleagues in 2024 reviewed the role of interoception in affect and emphasized that bodily signals are not side details. They are part of the construction of emotion and experience itself. So when awareness changes moment to moment, one reason is that internal bodily signaling keeps changing too. Heart rate, muscle tension, breathing, visceral sensation, and autonomic arousal alter the field in which meaning appears. But this is also where philosophical argument begins. One perspective says the truth is in the mechanism. Consciousness changes because neural oscillations, network dynamics, arousal systems, and bodily signals are changing. Another says the truth is in lived experience. Consciousness changes because the person is always situated, embodied, temporal. And meaning-making, the scientific mechanism, is descriptive but not exhaustive. Another says what we call consciousness is not one thing at all, but multiple interacting levels: wakefulness, reportability, phenomenal experience, access, self-model, attention memory, bodily feeling. And then another voice says, perhaps these are not fundamentally different truths, but different cuts through the same event. That is worth pausing over, because so much debate in consciousness science and philosophy can sound like a battle over final ownership. One school argues for global workspace theory, another for integrated information theory, another for predictive processing, another for higher order thought, another for phenomenology, another for contemplative first-person methods. The Cogitate Consortium's adversarial collaboration in 2025, directly comparing major theories like global workspace and integrated information, is powerful precisely because it shows how difficult it still is to settle the field cleanly. We do not yet have one theory that has humbled all the others decisively. So what do we do with that? One option is to pick a camp and defend it as an identity. Another is to recognize that at least some of these perspectives may be naming different aspects of the same lived reality. The mechanistic view explains how states correlate with changing access. The phenomenological view explains what changing access feels like from within. The contemplative view may notice the fluctuation directly in experience. The psychological view shows what happens behaviorally when those fluctuations alter judgment, attention, and action. There may still be real incompatibilities among some theories, but there is also often a battle of emphasis, language, and intellectual territory that can disguise underlying overlap. That matters for the tone of this series because I am less interested in turning consciousness into a tribal debate and more interested in making it readable. And here is the readable truth. Moment to moment awareness changes because the living system is never standing still. Take grief. Grief changes time. It changes salience. It changes how the mind moves. One sentence that would normally pass through you harmlessly may suddenly feel unbearable because the whole inner field is already weighted. The body is carrying loss. The mind is more selective. Memory is closer to the surface. And even ordinary language can land with unusual force. Is that because the truth changed? Not exactly. It is because the state through which truth appears has changed. Take attraction. Attraction sharpens some forms of awareness and distorts others. Attention locks in. Subtle cues become vivid. Possibility expands in one direction while other realities fall away. The body feels more charged, more future-oriented, more predictive. In one sense, you are more awake. In another sense, you may be less clear. This is why it is not enough to say consciousness is simply higher or lower. Sometimes it is narrower and more vivid at once. Sometimes it is intensely alive and selectively blind. Take illness. Illness often reduces tolerance for complexity. Tasks that would normally feel ordinary begin to feel too much. Conversation requires more effort. Emotional regulation may become harder. The brain and body are reallocating resources. The world gets smaller not because the person has become small, but because the state has reduced what is available. This is why one can feel different in illness than in health without requiring any big metaphysical change in the self. Take relief. Relief widens the world again. The mind that was locked onto danger or pressure suddenly has room. Things that felt impossible an hour ago become manageable. Meaning softens. Possibility returns. The same life has not fundamentally changed, and yet awareness has opened enough that reality itself seems different. This is what it means to say consciousness moves on a sliding scale. Now let's look at another scenario step by step. You are at work. The day has been overloaded. There have been too many tabs open, too many decisions, too many interruptions, too much small social effort. By late afternoon, you receive a simple request from a colleague. Step 1. The sentence is read. Step 2. Because the system is already saturated, the request is weighted as heavier than it might otherwise be. Step 3. The body registers demand. Step 4. Attention collapses around the request. Step 5. The reflective mind loses some access to spacious interpretation. Step 6. Irritation rises. Step 7. The request now feels unreasonable, intrusive, or disrespectful. What happened? Did the colleague become unreasonable in an objective sense? Maybe, but maybe not. The more immediate truth is that overload altered the scale of awareness. The request was not received from open ground. It was received from an already narrowed state. Schumann and colleagues in 2025, studying fatigue networks, reinforced this broader point. Fatigue changes the neural conditions for effort and control. That means the late-day self is not simply the morning self with the same access and less virtue. It is a differently available self. This is why a purely rational narrative never quite works. A purely rational approach says, if the facts are the same, the interpretation should stay the same. But that is not how embodied consciousness works. The facts may be stable while the field of reception changes, and when the field changes, the meaning changes with it. This is not irrationality in the cheap sense. It is an embodiment. Here philosophy becomes a useful ally rather than an enemy of science. Phenomenology insists that experience is always from somewhere, from a body, a mood, a perspective, a horizon of significance. It refuses the fantasy of a disembodied observer. Neuroscience, in its best moments, says something parallel. The organism's internal condition is part of the perceptual event. Neither view needs to cancel the other. They are naming different layers of the same instability. So perhaps there is not one truth in the sense of one final vocabulary, but there may be one lived reality showing itself through different languages. The physiological language speaks of arousal, interoception, network dynamics, and attentional gating. The psychological language speaks of mood, fatigue, salience, and responsiveness. The philosophical language speaks of lived structure, embodiment, horizon, and situatedness. The contemplative language may speak of contraction, openness, attachment, or clarity, and in lived experience, these are often not enemies. They are translations. The problem begins when the ego enters the room and says, my language alone owns the real. That happens in science. It happens in philosophy. It happens in spirituality. It happens in ordinary life too. One person says, this is just neurology. Another says, no, this is all nervous system and trauma. Another says, no, this is pure consciousness. Another says, no, this is simply poor thinking. Sometimes each is touching something true, but identity gets involved. The theory becomes more than a map. It becomes a self-position, a way to win, to explain, to dominate, to belong, to be the one who sees clearly. And once that happens, the theory starts serving the ego rather than the truth. The deeper truth may be quieter. Awareness changes because we are organisms, not detached intellects. Awareness changes because the body is part of the mind. Awareness changes because attention moves. Awareness changes because states arise. Awareness changes because memory, fear, fatigue, relief, purpose, loss, and attraction all alter the field. Awareness changes because consciousness is lived, not simply possessed. That is a truth many languages can point toward, and if we take that seriously, we stop asking, why can't I remain the same all day? We begin asking, what conditions are shaping access right now? That is a different kind of intelligence, an intelligence less obsessed with proving one theory supreme, and more interested in reading the living sequence honestly. Because what matters most in daily life is not whether you can defend the right abstract model at dinner. What matters is whether you can recognize that the self in exhaustion is not the self in relief, that the self in shame is not the self in spaciousness, that the self in urgency is not the self in stillness, that the self under grief is not the self under ordinary weather. That means the work is not to force one stable version of you to exist all day. The work is to become literate in fluctuation, to notice the shift, to recognize the narrowing, to respect the widening, to stop building a fixed identity out of temporary states, to stop demanding sameness from a consciousness that is, by its nature, dynamic. That is why awareness changes moment to moment, because life is moving. The body is moving, the world is moving, and consciousness, being lived through all of that, moves too. Once that is understood, a great many things become less mysterious, not easy, but less mysterious, and that alone can be a kind of mercy. What narrows and widens consciousness? If consciousness moves on a spectrum, rather than operating like a switch, then the next question is unavoidable. What narrows it, and what widens it? Because awareness does not fluctuate randomly. It is shaped, pressured, guided, pulled inward, opened outward, compressed by some conditions, and expanded by others. And once we begin to see that more clearly, we stop judging ourselves as though every state were self-generated in isolation. We begin to recognize that consciousness is not only something we have. It is something that changes according to the conditions under which we are trying to live. Research across affective neuroscience, interoception, attention science, and stress physiology keeps returning to this same point in different language. Internal state alters the quality, breadth, and flexibility of conscious access. Cantoni in 2025 summarized this very directly, noting that positive effect tends to broaden attention and flexible thinking, while negative effect narrows focus and promotes more detail-bound, threat-sensitive processing. So let's begin with narrowing. Consciousness narrows under fear. That is one of the oldest truths of the nervous system. When something feels threatening, attention contracts, peripheral awareness drops away, time changes, the body prepares, the field reorganizes around whatever feels most urgent. In one sense, this is adaptive. A system under threat does not want to remain spacious and curious if there is a tiger in the room. It wants efficiency. It wants readiness. It wants to simplify the world fast enough to act. But the modern problem is that many of the things that narrow awareness are not tigers. They are emails, silences, facial expressions, criticism, deadlines, shame, social exposure, uncertainty, and overload. The mechanism may still be preparing for survival, but the environment is often psychological, relational, and symbolic rather than physically catastrophic. That is why someone can become intensely certain under activation while actually seeing less of the whole. Stress narrows consciousness in much the same way. Not because all stress is bad, but because prolonged or cumulative stress changes the range of what can be held at once. Under stress, the body is less willing to tolerate ambiguity. Attention becomes more selective. Irritation rises more quickly. Emotional flexibility drops. The same conversation becomes harder to hold. The same request feels heavier. The same problem feels closer and larger. This is not just a poetic way of speaking. Reviews linking stress, exhaustion, and cognition show that under strain, the system loses some of its ability to regulate complexity. Schmiel and colleagues, 2025, in their mechanistic review of burnout, describe emotional exhaustion and depersonalization as conditions that alter not only mood but cognitive functioning and self-related experience. That matters because depersonalization in ordinary life often looks like narrowed access rather than total collapse. The person is still there, still operating, but the richness of contact has been reduced. Shame narrows consciousness in its own distinctive way. Fear says, something dangerous is happening. Shame says, something is wrong with me, and that changes the whole field. Under shame, the world often collapses inward. The body may become hot, tight, exposed, hidden, or frozen. Curiosity tends to disappear. Perspective shrinks. The self becomes an object. Everything begins to organize around being seen, judged, rejected, diminished, or wanting to disappear. In that state, a person can become intensely preoccupied and yet less conscious in a wider sense, because consciousness has collapsed into one painful frame. The shame state is often subjectively vivid, but perceptually narrow. The system is not taking in the whole room. It is circling one unbearable center. That is one reason shame can be so distorting. It feels total while actually reducing access. The broader literature on social threat and interoception repeatedly supports this pattern, showing that negative self-referential effect changes attentional allocation and bodily signaling in ways that alter the field of awareness. Overstimulation narrows consciousness differently again. This is not always about one sharp emotional event. Sometimes narrowing happens because the system is simply carrying too much noise, too many tabs open, too many social demands, too many decisions, too much visual input, too many competing priorities, too many incomplete loops. Under overstimulation, the body may not feel afraid in the obvious sense, but awareness still contracts. Subtlety becomes harder to hold. The system begins choosing simplicity over depth because depth costs too much. You can feel this in ordinary life when small requests become strangely intolerable, or when the mind starts treating everything as equally urgent, simply because it can no longer rank properly. Recent work on sensory overstimulation and environmental load points toward exactly these effects. The body and attention systems are not built for endless, unmodulated input without cost. Fatigue narrows consciousness too, but often in a quieter way. It blunts the edges of awareness rather than sharpening them. It reduces cognitive flexibility. It makes some truths less reachable. It lowers the threshold at which frustration, hopelessness, or indifference begin to dominate. Under fatigue, awareness may not feel dramatically contracted. It may feel dimmer, flatter, or more effortful, but that dimming is still narrowing. It reduces access to complexity, to patience, to a wider perspective. In the morning, you may have been able to hold the whole. By evening, you may only be able to hold what is immediately in front of you. This is one reason people say things at night that they would never quite mean in the same way in a rested state. Consciousness has not disappeared. Access has changed. Reviews of fatigue management and cognitive load, including recent work in healthcare settings, reinforce how strongly fatigue affects performance, attention, and error proneness, which in lived terms means it changes how the world can be held. Now let's turn to widening. Consciousness widens under safety, not because safety solves every problem, but because it reduces the body's need to collapse around threats. When the system feels safe enough, attention can spread, more of the room becomes available, more than one interpretation can coexist, time feels less compressed, the body softens enough for curiosity to re-enter. This is one reason relational safety matters so deeply, not only because it feels nice, but because it changes what consciousness can do. Under safety, awareness often becomes more spacious, more tolerant, more able to remain with uncertainty without instantly converting it into a conclusion. Belonging widens consciousness in a related way. Holt-Lundstad in 2024 reviewed the evidence showing that social connection is a critical factor in mental and physical health. Zanow and colleagues in 2024 showed that social cohesion and belonging help mediate subjective well-being. These findings matter because belonging not only makes us feel less lonely, it changes the conditions of awareness. When the system feels socially held, it often has more room, less vigilance, less anticipatory scanning, more available bandwidth for reflection, play, imagination, and learning. Belonging does not erase pain, but it often lowers the cost of being conscious in a fuller way. Relief widens consciousness too. This is one of the most recognizable state changes in ordinary life. The pressure lifts, the expected threat does not arrive, the call goes well, the diagnosis is not as feared, the argument settles, the waiting ends, the body softens, and suddenly thought becomes more flexible again. Things that felt impossible 30 minutes ago become workable, meaning widens, possibility returns. This tells us something important. The difference between despair and perspective is not always a difference of philosophy. Sometimes it is a difference of state. Relief does not merely change how we feel. It changes what kind of consciousness becomes available. Purpose can widen consciousness differently, not by softening everything, but by organizing attention coherently. When a person feels a meaningful direction, the field often sharpens without becoming quite so defensive. Some kinds of purpose reduce fragmentation. They pull the system into alignment. That is why meaningful work, creative absorption, devotion, or clear intention can create a more coherent form of awareness than scattered obligation. Purpose does not automatically equal truth, of course. A fanatic also feels purposeful, but in its healthier form, purpose widens by integrating rather than compressing. It gives consciousness a center without forcing everything into emergency. Aesthetic and contemplative states can widen awareness as well. This might happen through music, nature, prayer, meditation, art, or a felt moment of stillness in which the body no longer needs to defend itself so tightly. These states are not all identical, and we should resist romanticizing them, but they do reveal that consciousness can become broader, slower, and more spacious under certain conditions. Contemplative science increasingly overlaps with this point. Research on mindfulness, emotional regulation, and attentional training suggests that some practices can reduce over-identification with thoughts and enhance interoceptive awareness, allowing states to be noticed without being immediately obeyed. That does not mean contemplation is magic. It means some forms of practice widen the interval between state and interpretation. So if narrowing and widening are both real, what does that mean for the idea of truth? It means that what feels true is often state-shaped. That is a sobering insight. Under fear, one truth dominates. Under relief, another becomes visible. Under shame, the self seems small. Under belonging, the world becomes more possible. Under fatigue, complexity becomes unreachable. Under purpose, energy coheres. Under overload, everything presses inward. Under rest, nuance returns. Does that mean truth itself is relative? Not necessarily. It means our access to truth is partial, changing, and state-dependent, and this is where different perspectives start arguing over language. The neuroscientific view may say, arousal systems, predictive processing, interoception, attentional gating, and network dynamics are determining what becomes available. The psychological view may say, threat, shame, belonging, purpose, and overload alter appraisal, attention, mood, and cognitive flexibility. The phenomenological view may say, consciousness is always embodied, situated, and horizon-shaped. The world appears differently depending on the mode of being of the one who lives it. The contemplative view may say, contraction and openness, grasping and spaciousness, fixation and presence, are shifting the field of awareness, and often these are not fundamentally opposing truths. They are different vocabularies for the same movement. This matters because modern minds often want one authorized language, one final winner, one explanation that can absorb all the others. But perhaps the wiser stance is to see that narrowing and widening happen across levels at once. The body changes, attention changes, meaning changes, the lived world changes. The words we use to describe the shift may differ, but the shift itself is one event lived through several lenses. The ego, however, often wants ownership. It wants my explanation to be the explanation. My school, my model, my tradition, my tribe, my preferred vocabulary. And once that happens, the debate is no longer only about truth. It becomes about status, identity, territory, and the need to feel conceptually safe. That is not just a problem in academia or spirituality. It is a problem in ordinary life too. We do it interpersonally all the time. One person says, I'm just exhausted. Another says, no, you're triggered. Another says, no, this is all nervous system dysregulation. Another says, no, this is a thought problem. Another says, no, this is your intuition. Sometimes each is partly right, but the fight for interpretive supremacy can become its own narrowing. The need to be correct can reduce awareness just as much as fear does. So perhaps the more mature approach is not to collapse everything into one master language, but to ask a more faithful question. What is happening to the field of awareness right now? Is it narrowing? Is it widening? Is it sharpening, dulling, or fragmenting? Is it gathering? Is it opening? Or is it compressing? That question is more useful than many of the theories we defend, because it returns us to the living event, and in lived reality, narrowing and widening are not abstract ideas. They happen in conversations, in arguments, in texts, in illness, in relief, in grief, in longing, in public performance, in solitude, in belonging, in overstimulation, in shame, and in love. The work is to become literate in them, to know what narrows you quickly, what widens you genuinely, what gives you false certainty through activation, what gives you honest spaciousness through safety, what helps you hold more, what leaves you only capable of one sharp and painful truth at a time. Because consciousness is not just moving randomly, it is responding, and the more honestly we can see what narrows and widens it, the less likely we are to mistake a contracted state for the whole of reality, or a widened state for permanent arrival. That is where wisdom begins, not remaining wide all the time, not in condemning every narrowing, but in learning to recognize the shape of the field as it changes. And once you can do that, the whole idea of self starts changing too, because you begin to realize that the you who sees from contraction is not the only you available, and the you who sees from spaciousness is not a fantasy either. Both are real, neither is the whole, and the movement between them is part of what it means to be conscious at all. The myth of a single stable self, one of the most persistent illusions many of us live under, is the illusion of the single stable self, the idea that there is one fixed me moving through the day in a continuous, evenly available way, one identity, one center, one settled personality that remains more or less the same regardless of fatigue, shame, illness, grief, urgency, attraction, overload, relief, or belonging. We speak as though this were true all the time. We say, I'm just like this. I'm an anxious person. I'm bad with people. I'm not very emotional. I'm calm under pressure. I'm someone who can't cope with uncertainty. I'm just detached. I'm not good at resting. I'm strong. I'm weak. I'm difficult. I'm clear-headed. I'm too sensitive. Sometimes those statements point towards something real. Patterns do exist. Temperament exists. History exists. Repetition matters. But very often what we call identity is partly a snapshot of a repeated state that has been lived in for so long it now feels like essence. That is the myth this section needs to loosen, because much of what we call self may actually be mistaken for identity. That does not mean the self is unreal. It means the self is more fluid, more conditioned, and more context-shaped than most of us are taught to recognize. The anxious self, for example, can feel like the only self when anxiety is active. When the body is scanning, the mind is narrowing, and possibility is shrinking, the whole world starts arranging itself around threat and anticipation. In that state, anxiety does not feel like one perspective among many. It feels like realism. It feels like common sense. It feels like this is just who I am. This is how I see things. But then there may be another day. A day after rest. A day after safety. A day after reassurance finally lands. A day after relief. A day after belonging. A day after enough quiet has returned to the body. Suddenly the same person can think, maybe I'm not fundamentally anxious. Maybe I've been living in an anxious state so often that I began mistaking it for my nature. That is not a small difference, because if anxiety is identity, then there is nowhere to stand outside it. But if anxiety is a state, even a recurring one, even a familiar one, even a deeply conditioned one, then other possibilities remain. The same is true of detachment. Many people describe themselves as detached, independent, unemotional, or difficult to reach. And again, sometimes there is truth there, but very often, detachment is not the deepest self. It is a state, a strategy, a shape the system takes under certain conditions. The person who feels flat in conflict may feel deeply alive in quiet tenderness. The person who seems unreachable under pressure may become profoundly available when safe enough. The person who thinks they are just numb may discover that what they really are is exhausted, defended, or living too long in a state where full feeling has become costly. This is why identity language can sometimes imprison us. It takes something dynamic and turns it into something fixed. It takes something conditional and turns it into something essential. It takes something that rises and falls and nails it into the floor. Once that happens, we begin living according to the myth we have repeated. That is one of the subtle powers of self-description. The phrase becomes familiar. The familiarity becomes certainty. The certainty becomes identity, and identity begins deciding what kind of life we believe is possible for us. If I'm just an angry person, then perhaps I should stop looking at what states activate anger most quickly. If I'm just bad at intimacy, then perhaps I stop examining what happens to me under closeness, exposure, or uncertainty. If I'm just not disciplined, then perhaps I stop noticing the relationship between my so-called lack of discipline and fatigue, hopelessness, social overwhelm, or inner conflict. If I'm just the calm one, then perhaps I never ask how much of that calm is real groundedness and how much is emotional suppression. This is where the myth of the stable self becomes more than philosophical. It becomes practical, because the way we name ourselves shapes the possibilities we allow, and modern life constantly encourages fixed identity language. It prefers labels. It prefers categories. It prefers profiles. It prefers stability of presentation. It prefers a self that can be described, understood quickly, managed, predicted, and repeated. But conscious life is not always that clean. Sometimes the you who speaks under shame is not the you who appears under relief. Sometimes the you who makes promises in clarity is not the same you who has access to those promises under exhaustion. Sometimes the you who believes deeply in connection at midday is not the same you who can tolerate closeness by late evening when the system is depleted. Sometimes the you who feels wise in solitude becomes frightened in conflict. Sometimes the you who feels strong at work becomes fragile in intimacy. Sometimes the you who feels detached in numbness becomes flooded as soon as the numbness loosens. So which one is the real self? Perhaps that is the wrong question. Perhaps the better question is, what conditions bring different versions of me forward? That question is less flattering to the ego because it gives up the fantasy of one perfectly stable, self-contained center. But it is often much more honest. It allows us to understand that selfhood is not only something we have, but something we access differently depending on our state. This is not an argument for fragmentation in the dramatic sense. It is not saying there is no continuity at all. Clearly, there is continuity. Memory carries forward. Character carries forward. History carries forward. Values can carry forward. But continuity is not the same as sameness. A river remains a river. That does not mean the water is identical every moment. In the same way, there may be continuity of self without uniformity of consciousness. That is a much more useful framework, because then we can begin speaking in more precise ways. Not, I am hopeless. But hopelessness becomes very convincing in me when I'm exhausted, ashamed, and alone. Not, I am cold. But I become emotionally distant when I feel unsafe, overstimulated, or unable to trust the room. Not, I am a mess. But my sense of self fragments when too many pressures arrive at once and I lose access to reflection. Not, I am finally healed, but in this state, rested, relieved, connected, and open, I can feel parts of myself that are usually harder to access. That kind of language is not weaker. It is more accurate. It gives the self some room to breathe. It allows for change without pretending everything is infinitely fluid. It allows for pattern without turning pattern into fate. It allows for responsibility without demanding impossible sameness. Perhaps most importantly, it allows compassion to enter where shame usually dominates. Because many people suffer not only from the state they are in, but from the identity they build out of it. They do not just feel anxious, they become an anxious person. They do not just feel numb, they become someone who can't feel. They do not just feel overwhelmed, they become incapable. They do not just feel detached, they become unloving. They do not just shut down, they become broken. That is a terrible burden to carry, especially when the state itself may already be painful enough. So the real work here is not to deny that patterns exist. It is to stop turning every repeated state into a final verdict on who we are. Because if awareness moves, then identity must be held more lightly. Not loosely in the sense of having no center, but lightly enough that we can ask, who am I in this state? Who else am I in another? What in me is consistent? What in me is conditional? What in me is wounded? What in me is defended? What in me is alive? What in me only appears when conditions allow it? That is where this part of the episode lands. The myth of the single stable self is compelling because it offers certainty. But conscious life may ask something more mature than certainty. It may ask us to recognize that much of what we call self is state-shaped, context-sensitive, and more dynamic than we like to admit. That recognition does not erase identity. It makes identity more honest. And once that honesty begins, we become less likely to mistake one temporary mode of consciousness for the whole truth of who we are. State shifts in everyday life. The easiest way to understand that awareness moves is not through theory alone, but through ordinary life. Because most of us already know, in a lived way, that we are not the same under all conditions. We know what it is like to wake after poor sleep, and find that even simple things feel heavier. We know what it is like to be ill, and suddenly lose patience with complexity. We know what it is like to be grieving, and feel time change shape around us. We know what it is like to feel attracted to someone, and find certain details becoming vivid, while other realities fade into the background. We know what it is like to be overstimulated, and feel as though even a small request has become too much. These are not separate stories from consciousness. They are consciousness in its ordinary movement. Take fatigue. Fatigue does not just make us slower. It changes what we can hold. It reduces tolerance. It makes nuance harder to access. A conversation that would feel manageable in one state suddenly feels like an effort. A decision that would normally be simple starts seeming strangely complicated. Or the opposite happens. Complexity becomes too hard to tolerate, and we rush toward the nearest conclusion simply because it is easier than staying open. Under fatigue, the self often becomes narrower. Not because character has changed, but because access has changed. Illness can do something similar. When the body is unwell, awareness often becomes more local, more immediate, more body-bound. The system has less room for abstraction, less appetite for social complexity, and less tolerance for noise, contradiction, and mental strain. Things that seem easy in health can feel distant or unmanageable in illness. Even emotional interpretation changes. The body's discomfort becomes part of the lens, and the world is received through a reduced range of available energy. Grief changes awareness in another way. Grief alters time. It alters attention. It alters what the world seems to contain. A person in grief may still function, still show up, still answer questions, still complete practical tasks. But the field is different. Some things lose color. Other things become unbearably sharp. Memory becomes more active. Presence can become fragmented. Certain words, songs, places, or pauses carry enormous weight. Time may feel both slowed and unreal. A day can pass in a blur and still feel impossible to cross. Grief does not simply add sadness to consciousness. It reshapes the whole terrain through which experience is received. Attraction sharpens certain forms of awareness while distorting others. A person you are drawn to can suddenly become the center of gravity in a room. Small details become vivid: tone, timing, expression, pauses, gestures. You notice more, you feel more, but you may also see less of the wider picture. Attraction can heighten awareness while narrowing it at the same time. It gives intensity, but not always balance. It can make possibility feel real before reality has fully caught up. Urgency narrows consciousness in a way many of us know well. When something feels pressing, the field contracts. The body organizes around speed. Attention becomes selective. The mind starts moving toward action before reflection has had enough time to gather. This can be useful in a genuine emergency. But much of modern urgency is not an emergency in that sense. It is psychological, professional, relational, symbolic. And still, the body may not know the difference. So a message, a deadline, a shift in tone, an unexpected demand, all of it can create the feeling that there is no time for spaciousness. In urgency, awareness often becomes functional, but thinner. Relief does the opposite. Relief restores perspective. The moment the pressure lifts, the world changes. The body softens. Thought becomes less rigid. What felt impossible an hour ago becomes manageable. What felt catastrophic begins to return to proportion. This is one of the clearest examples of how state alters consciousness, because relief does not usually change the external world very much. It changes the body's relationship to it. Purpose can also shift awareness. When a person feels deeply engaged, meaningful, or called into something, attention often coheres. The mind stops scattering quite so much. The self feels less fragmented. There is a kind of sharpened aliveness that does not feel like panic, but like alignment. Purpose can gather the field in a healthy way. It can make consciousness feel less diffuse and more anchored. Overstimulation, by contrast, can make even small tasks feel total. Too much noise, too many people, too many demands, too many messages, too many unfinished loops. Eventually the body starts treating ordinary life as too much incoming reality. And once that threshold is crossed, tiny things begin landing with disproportionate force. The simple question feels invasive. A minor inconvenience feels huge. A small interruption feels like collapse. This is not because the person has become irrational. It is because awareness is already oversaturated. Conflict changes consciousness too. Under tension, some people become sharper but less spacious. Others go vague, blank, or flooded. Some become more articulate and less real. Others lose words altogether. The important thing is not which pattern appears, but that conflict changes access. The same person who can think clearly in one setting may lose that clarity in another when the body reads danger or exposure. And then there is the difference between solitude and social life. Some people widen in solitude and narrow in company. Others contract when alone and become more coherent in a safe connection. Some feel ease in familiar groups and hypervigilance in unfamiliar ones. Some move through social spaces with openness, while others are constantly tracking how they are being received. Social ease and social vigilance are not just personality traits. They are states of consciousness with different costs, different freedoms, and different levels of access. This is the point of the whole section. Awareness does not only change in extraordinary moments. It changes in ordinary conditions. Fatigue, illness, attraction, grief, urgency, relief, purpose, overstimulation, conflict, solitude, social ease, social vigilance. All of these change the shape of consciousness, and once you begin noticing that in daily life, the whole idea of a fixed, evenly available self starts to loosen. You stop asking only, why am I like this? And begin asking, what state am I in right now? That question alone can make life far more readable. Integration, working with fluctuation rather than denying it. So, where does all of this leave us? If awareness moves, if consciousness sharpens and dulls, narrows and widens, gathers and fragments depending on state, then the real task is no longer trying to become one fixed version of ourselves all the time. The task is learning how to work with fluctuation honestly. That may not sound dramatic, but it is one of the most important shifts a person can make. Because many of us do not suffer only from changing states. We suffer from the way we interpret them. We turn fluctuation into failure. We turn temporary narrowing into identity. We turn a tired mind into a broken self. We turn a flooded moment into proof that we have not grown. We turn a clear state into a final answer, and a contracted state into an ultimate verdict. But consciousness does not ask for that kind of rigidity. It asks for literacy, the literacy to recognize, I am not equally available right now. I am in a state that is shaping what feels true. My access to patience, complexity, humor, hope, tenderness, and perspective is changing. This does not mean nothing is real. It means I need to understand the conditions in which reality is appearing to me. That is a much more mature way of relating to experience. Because once you accept that awareness fluctuates, you stop demanding from yourself the kind of constancy that no living system can sustain. You stop expecting the self under grief to think exactly like the self under relief. You stop asking the exhausted mind to offer the same generosity as the rested one. You stop assuming that the person you are in shame has the same access to truth as the person you are in calm. You stop punishing yourself for state shifts as though they were moral betrayals. In that space, something important becomes possible. Compassion without passivity. responsibility without cruelty, observation without collapse. That is what working with fluctuation actually means. It does not mean excusing everything. It does not mean saying, well, I was in a state, so nothing counts. It does not mean abandoning accountability because consciousness changes. It means becoming more precise about what is happening so that accountability becomes more truthful instead of more brutal. For example, if you know that fatigue narrows you, then the work is not to shame yourself for being different when tired. The work is to learn what tiredness does to your awareness, your tone, your conclusions, your patience, and your capacity to remain spacious. If you know that overstimulation makes small things feel huge, then the work is not to call yourself dramatic. It is to recognize the narrowing earlier and respond with more intelligence before the state becomes the whole world. If you know that relief makes you feel clear, hopeful, and decisive, then the work is not to mistrust all good states. It is to understand that relief is also a lens, and that even widened states deserve gentle discernment. This is what many of us were never taught. We were taught to build identity. We were taught to defend positions. We were taught to explain ourselves. But we were not always taught to recognize the state. We were not taught to say, I am making meaning from exhaustion. I am hearing this through shame. I am trying to think from inside urgency. I am much wider right now because something in me has softened. I am not lost, I am narrowed. I am not permanently detached, I am shut down right now. I am not finally healed, I am resourced enough in this moment to access more of myself. That kind of language changes everything, because it allows you to stay in relationship with yourself as a changing being rather than a fixed object. And perhaps that is the deeper invitation of this episode. To stop treating consciousness like a possession and start meeting it like a weather system, in the metaphorical sense, not chaotic weather, not meaningless weather, but changing weather. Some days visibility is good, some days it is reduced, some hours are clear, some are dense, some states open the horizon, some states make the world feel very small, and wisdom does not come from pretending the weather never changes. Wisdom comes from learning how to read it. What is narrowing me right now? What is widening me? What am I no longer able to hold? What is becoming more available? What part of my current certainty belongs to the state rather than the whole truth? What part of my hopelessness belongs to fatigue rather than reality? What part of my confidence belongs to relief rather than final clarity? These questions do not weaken the self. They refine it. They make it possible to live with more flexibility and less self-deception. Because the danger of denying fluctuation is not only that it makes us harsh with ourselves, it also makes us unreliable interpreters of our own experience. If we insist that the self is always stable, then every state starts pretending to be the whole self. Every contraction becomes who I am. Every widening becomes who I truly am now. Every mood becomes philosophy. Every bodily condition becomes an identity. That is too much weight for any temporary state to carry. So this final integration is asking for something quieter and more disciplined. Notice the fluctuations. Respect them. Track them. Work with them. Do not build your whole self out of them. And that last point may be the most important. The state matters. But it is not the whole of you. A contracted state matters. A widened state matters. A numb state matters. A hopeful state matters. A grief state matters. A relief state matters. But none of them alone gets to define the entire person. That is where conscious living becomes more spacious. You stop living under dictatorship of the present state. You begin recognizing that awareness moves and that you can learn its terrain. You become less impressed by absolute statements and more interested in conditions. You become less likely to say, this is who I am, and more able to ask, who am I in this state, and what becomes possible in another. That is not instability. That is maturity. Because maturity is not becoming one permanent version of yourself. It is becoming able to recognize the changing versions without handing all authority to whichever one is currently speaking. So perhaps the simplest way to say all of this is, conscious living does not mean freezing awareness into one ideal state. It means learning how to live truthfully inside a moving range. That is where the work becomes real. So this episode has really been about a movement many of us feel, but do not always name clearly enough, the movement of awareness itself. We began with the recognition that you are not equally conscious all day. From there, we explored consciousness as a spectrum, rather than a switch, not simply present or absent, but shifting in intensity, clarity, contact, and range. We looked at why awareness changes moment to moment, what narrows it, what widens it, how state shapes perception, and how much of what we call identity may actually be state mistaken for selfhood. We moved through fatigue, illness, attraction, grief, urgency, relief, purpose, overstimulation, conflict, solitude, and social vigilance. And through all of that, one thing became clearer. The self is not always equally available to itself. That is not an error in the system. That is part of the condition of being alive. Because consciousness is not static. It is lived through a body, through attention, through memory, through emotion, through circumstance, through social environments, through physiology, through loss, through longing, through pressure, and through rest. It is not something you simply possess once and for all in one stable quantity. It is something you move through. That matters because many of us have spent years turning temporary states into permanent self-descriptions. We have called ourselves weak when we were exhausted. We have called ourselves detached when we were shut down. We have called ourselves broken when we were grief-struck. We have called ourselves clear when we were simply relieved. We have called ourselves hopeless when awareness had narrowed. We have called ourselves whole when a wider state finally gave us some room. This episode has been trying to loosen that habit, not by making the self vague, not by pretending that nothing is true, but by making us more precise, more able to say, this is the state I'm in. This is what it is doing to my awareness. This is what becomes harder here. This is what becomes possible here. This is not the whole of me, even though it feels total right now. That is a very different form of self-knowledge. Perhaps that is the real conclusion of episode 5. Awareness is not a switch to be judged. It is a terrain to be learned. The more honestly you learn that terrain, the less likely you are to mistake one state for the whole truth of who you are. In the next episode, we move into one of the most powerful and consequential forms of narrowing there is: strong emotion. If awareness shifts with state, then few states shape consciousness more dramatically than emotional activation. And one of the great problems of emotional activation is this: it often feels like the truth, not partial truth, not state-shaped truth, not one lens among others. Emotional hijacking and false certainty. There, we'll explore what happens when feeling certain is not the same as seeing clearly. We'll look at emotional flooding, defensive conviction, moral heat, urgency, projection, jealousy, panic, shame, righteousness, and the strange seduction of certainty when the system is activated. We'll ask why strong feelings simplify reality so quickly. Why do online arguments intensify so easily? Why relational assumptions harden under emotional charge? Why panic can feel like revelation? Why outrage can feel like moral purity? Why shame can make one explanation seem final? And why the mind, once emotionally seized, often mistakes intensity for accuracy. Because one of the most dangerous things about strong emotion is not only that it hurts, it is convincing. It tells you, this is obvious, this is what happened, this is what they meant, this is who I am now, this is the only interpretation left. When emotion narrows awareness like that, reflection often arrives too late. So in the next episode, we move from fluctuating awareness into one of the forces most capable of hijacking it, from spectrum to flooding, from movement to seizure, from changing consciousness to the dangerous comfort of certainty. That is where we go next. So as we end this episode, I leave you with this: who you become in different states. Notice the self that appears in fatigue, the self that appears in relief, the self that appears in shame, in grief, in attraction, in urgency, in peace. Notice how quickly a temporary state can start speaking as though it were the whole truth. And when it does, stay curious, not dismissive, not afraid, not swallowed whole, just curious enough to remember that awareness moves, and that no single moment gets to define all of you. Until next time, thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to the Consciousness Code podcast, episode 5, The Sliding Scale of Awareness: Why You Are Not Equally Conscious All Day. I'm James Miller.